Hello everyone, my name is Boulevard. Welcome to Tournament Tactician, something like the premier tournament tier list for Legends of Runeterra. Let's talk about the meta, because this is the last chance that you have to automatically qualify by winning a WCQ. Right? After this, we're going to have the Eternal Runeterra Open, then the LCQ, and then we are into the World Championship. It is happening it's like a month and a half away. There's really not a lot of time between now and Worlds, so this is one of the biggest events of the year, right? This is when we're going to crown one more direct invitee. It's very important that we all have a good comprehensive understanding of the meta. So when we look at the ladder, I've had some people, actually let's address this first. I've had some people sort of misconstruing my perception of the meta, because last week I made a video about how the meta was very mid-range, the patch was very incentivized towards mid-range, and how Janna Nyla wasn't really thriving in that environment. And now obviously, as you can see, Janna Nyla has reclaimed its #1 spot on the ladder, has been sitting there pretty happily for quite some time, and is performing extremely well in tournaments. One thing that I pointed out is looking at tournament data from the last 5 days of these daily events and even some of the weekend events, there are 7 tournaments I got to look at over the last 5 days, and Janna Nyla has won all 7 of them. So Boulevard, what are you talking about? Why are you flip-flopping? That's what we're here for, right? To talk about the meta, to understand. The builds of Janna Nyla have changed. No one is really running so when I made that video, a lot of the builds were still just kind of like this. It's just last season's Janna Nyla, kind of topping out at the Tide Dancer. Really just last meta's build with, Cloudwinder took a little bit of a nerf, whatever. Now we've really moved into the Sunken Temple builds. Wizened Helmsman is coming in, and I gotta say, Helmsman does a lot to shore up the mid-range matchup. And there are some people, myself included, that are running the Big Gale Song spell, the 5-mana one. And I like that card a lot, not just for the mid-range matchups, but also for the mirror. When you and your opponent are kind of doing the same thing at each other, even like a 6/5 bird is a really big difference maker, and it'll get pretty big pretty quickly as you resolve more and more Helmsmans. So I think the Helmsman version, very good. The Janna Nyla of last meta, not a fan of this anymore. I really think that this is where you want to be at, and this is where most people are. This is where almost everyone is at. Now, whether or not you want to run the 5-mana Gale Song is totally up to you. I've been playing a lot more ladder than usual. I just got above 400 LP, so I'm getting up there. Just so that I could get a really good understanding of the meta. And I've primarily been playing Nyla Janna, Jax Ornn, and Seraphine Set Karma, because I feel like those are some of the major players that I need to get my hands on a little bit more to understand, whereas Champion Strength is a little more straightforward. The thing I will say about Nyla Janna is this deck is extremely broken. This will be your build around, your ban strategy. The meta revolves around Nyla Janna right now. This isn't really a deck you can just pick up and go. I'd recommend that you have at least 40 games on this deck before you try to queue it up for the Open. The one thing I will say about it is this deck is incredibly difficult to play perfectly, but it does not require perfect play. You can kind of limp over the finish line a lot of the time, and that's what Sunken Temple really does. It's very difficult to play a Sunken Temple deck perfectly, right? There's a lot of mana management that goes on, sort of preparing your odds for the next turn, because while you don't actually know what your hand is going to look like next turn, you can think about it a little bit. And that's why playing this deck at the highest level is going to be very difficult, but you don't have to. And that's why when I say play the good decks, I mean, play the decks where, you don't have to play perfectly. You don't get punished for one mistake. Your deck is so broken that it doesn't matter. That's really where Janna Nyla is falling, and this is something I would recommend that everybody have in their lineup. And we'll get into its counter picks and why those aren't very prevalent in a minute here. But I do want to shout out that, Janna Nyla, would I call it tier 0? I don't think so. I don't think it's that strong, but I think it's very good, and most importantly, it's doing very well into Chaff. And Chaff is just sort of when you look at a matchup chart, and there's 20 decks on there, and you're only looking for 5 of them, Chaff is the other 15. Janna Nyla is just so proactive and so strong in its removal, and Helmsman just really doubles down on not just the removal, but the burn strategy, because you can, get back copies of Divine Whirlwind to just get that little bit of extra push burn through onto your opponent. This deck is just extremely versatile, extremely powerful, and most importantly, proactive. When you're looking for things that are good into Chaff, that are good in Swiss rounds, you're really looking for proactivity. Scouts, there was a lot of talk about Janna Teemo. That was something that was sitting near the top of the meta when I made the mid-range video. And the problem that you immediately notice with Janna Teemo Champion Strength is that it is not beating the other Champion Strength deck, which is Scouts. Scouts is very low to the, very wide. Quinn, Mirai Warden, Island Navigator, and Scrutinizing Sergeant all summon a second unit. And that is going to outpace Piltover and Zon removal 100% of the time. Then you even have things like Inspiring Light to make sure that if they are running something like Divine Draft or Caustic Rift, that it's not going to be enough, that your units are going to be healthy enough to get through that and survive into the champion strength turn. So that's kind of where Scouts is at. Ash LeBlanc, this is the Aatrox vein of mid-midrange. So I have two camps. I have big midrange and I have mid-midrange. Big midrange is Aatrox and Jax. Mid-midrange is Ashe and Shen, Jarvan. And the triangle that we're kind of looking at here we have Janna. Janna, big midrange. Again, this is Aatrox, Jax. And then we have mid-midrange, which is Shen J4 and Ashe LeBlanc. And the way that things are going is big midrange beats Janna. Janna beats mid-midrange, and mid-midrange beats big midrange. And the reason that it works out that way is the frostbites and barriers of mid-midrange are just too effective for big midrange. They are losing their heartier units to these combat tricks, and then because these decks are like pretty high in attack and hard to interact with for a deck that really only has like combat tricks as removal, things like single combat and fish fight, like very not good into barrier and frostbite are the removal tools. So you're just kind of getting run over by all of the tools that mid-midrange has. However, where's the back button on this thing? However, big midrange is doing well into Janna because Janna's removal tools are not effective against big midrange. You know, you throw down a 5/5, a 5/4, or something like that. If Divine Whirlwind can't one-shot a unit, Janna's going to have a little bit of a problem. They only have so many Howling Gales. And the problem is that mid-midrange has a number of units that just die to Howling Gale. Ashe, LeBlanc, Trifarian Assessor, even Icevale Archer. That's 12 units in your deck. That's over 25% of your deck that die to Howling Gale, which is most of the time a 3-mana spell. Shen Jarvan has like, they have the 3/1 that gets barrier whenever something else gets barrier that just like dies to Mystic Shot, and that's not good. Also, Tidal Invocation is something that a lot of the Janna decks are playing as a one of. So effectively, it's really just like Janna's removal is good against Shen and Ashe. It is not good against Aatrox and Jax. The combat tricks from like barrier and frostbite are very good against Aatrox and Jax. They are not as good against Janna. And that's sort of the main meta triangle that we're looking at if you're wondering how you can be in such a mid-range meta and still have Janna come out on top. And because Ashe and Shen are so popular, they're really just pushing out the Aatrox and Jax, because one of the biggest issues is that mid-midrange beats big midrange harder than big midrange beats Janna. If big midrange is beating Janna like 60% of the time, mid-midrange is beating big midrange like 70-75% of the time. And so it just makes more sense to play Janna and mid-midrange and like not get beat by the other decks in the meta. So that's kind of where everything's settled out in the mid-range term. So like the meta is still mostly mid-range, and there are mid-range decks that are doing good into Janna. Unfortunately, those mid-range decks are not doing well into the rest of the field. And that's kind of where Darius Nar comes in as a little bit of a weird one, where I'm not quite sure how to classify this one. It feels like it should just fall under big midrange because it's got these really large units. It's got Bone Club. But really, like, when you look at the stats of the units, they're more mid-rangey, right? It's high attack, low HP. But because you have Bone Club and because you have strong finishers like Darius and Glacial Saurian and like just Battle Fury is a hell of a card, your matchup charts are different enough that like I just have Overwhelm classified outside of the mid-range blanket because it tends to be an outlier when tried to classify that way. So let's take a look at the actual data that I've got going on here now that I've kind of summarized. So your meta definers are Janna, Nyla, Champion Strength, and mid-range. That's Ashe and Shen Jarvan. Let's put that here because one thing that I've started to notice is that some people just pause the video and don't listen to the words that I'm saying, or like, you know, something, they like stop paying attention for 2 seconds and then miss something. These are the same fucking thing. Does everybody get that? Okay. This is going to come down here. Aatrox. Jax. These are the same thing. That's what that means. Okay, now that we've got that all under control, your meta staples and major players are going to be big mid-range and overwhelm. While Aatrox is pretty much completely out of the meta, which we'll get into its matchup charts down here and kind of why that is, Jax Ornn is still something that should be popping up with probably a top 5 presence. In fact, while we're here, let's go ahead and make some top 5 predictions, or at least get the table set up to do so. Flavors of aggro. It's not looking great for aggro. I think Elusives actually has a really good shot in this meta because the only nerf that the deck took was Sting Officer, and yeah, Omen Hawk got buffed to be able to block elusives, and that is a big hit to elusives. However, Jax Ornn is not something people are really looking at right now because they're so afraid of Ashe and Jarvan, and Ashe kind of sucks. So I wouldn't worry too much about their Omen Hawks. On top of the fact that I think elusives is beating Ashe even through Omen Hawk because Ashe doesn't kill quickly enough. They're not playing Reckoning. So, like, the Frostbites are not super effective against elusives, and the burn spells that elusives plays are still going to kill a lot of Ashe's unit, or at least, like, make them really tight on mana. If you want to think about, like, a way that, like, mid-range and big mid-range kind of differ is, like, mid-range is more tempo-reliant. You know, Jax can not put a card on the table until its combat code, can be totally fine with that, but, like, Ashe needs to put units down and have those units survive. Like, if they play a LeBlanc on 3 and that LeBlanc dies, that's rough because the Ashe that comes down on 4 is also probably dying if you don't have that, you know, the combat trick backup. Jarvan Shen, obviously, like, the more units you have on board, the more Shen procs you're going to get, the more survivable your units are. Aatrox, the big problem with Aatrox, I think, is that, like, Aatrox's power is tied to how good Ranger Knight Defector is, and right now Ranger Knight Defector is just not the strongest thing you can be doing in the format. Even if you get the quick attack or a spear onto, like, either a harp or a spear onto the Ranger Knight, it's still 6 mana, and a spear Ranger Knight is a harp Ranger Knight is pretty susceptible to dying to Howling Gale, and then a spear Ranger Knight is just, like, not a significant enough threat. So I don't expect to see a lot of Aatrox. I think Aatrox will probably put up similar numbers to what it did at the Runeterra Open, which is, like, 5-ish, probably less than that amongst the top 64. And I don't expect it to go as far as it did during the previous Runeterra Open either. I think Aatrox is something that we really just talk about as a theoretical Janna counter. So, whoopsie. Didn't mean to actually delete it. So, Janna Nyla, it's doing good into mid-range. Again, these are very tempo-reliant decks. Janna Nyla kind of throws tempo out the window by, like, you know, going, oh yeah, here's my Matrim on turn 2. I'm going to refill my spell mana with an updraft, and then boom, Howling Gale, your unit's dead. Here's a Sunken Temple. You can't deal with it. That's another big thing, is Sunken Temple, because we've got Seraphine set, which I was a little shocked when I went and looked at the ladder, and this is why I had to filter the Seraphine decks earlier, is, like I said, I'm sitting at about 400 LP. That puts me in, like, top 200 Masters. I've been playing mostly against Scouts and Seraphine decks over the last day. And what that reads to me as, like, this close to the event, I assume this is just people looking for their third deck, you know, trying to figure out if Seraphine is something they want to pair with the Janna Nyla, go into something else, and just making sure that, like, Scouts is as okay of a third deck as they hope it is the read that I've been getting from what I've been playing against. So I was a little surprised to see Seraphine down this far in the ladder, and again, Seraphine's going to be one of those weird decks where the data on it is very bad. By that, I mean, one, Seraphine decks are pretty much always going to have a sub 50% win rate. They're kind of hard to play. When Seraphine decks get above 50%, that's when you're going to be like, oh, that's means more than a normal deck being at 50+%. But what I also mean by that is that, like, there are so many different champion combinations. Like, here we see Seraphine set, Janna Seraphine set, ignore that one, and Karma Seraphine set. I've been playing Karma Seraphine set. It's 3 Seraphine, 2... set 1 Karma. Maybe it's 3 set 2 Seraphine. I just know it's only 1 Karma. I don't remember, okay? But it's been feeling okay. Nothing too special. But my point is, these are also Sunken Temple decks. And one of the things that Janna Nyla is going to do is, if you don't kill it the turn Sunken Temple comes down, or, like, aren't presenting lethal the turn Sunken Temple comes down, you're in for a really rough time. And you can't always just jam Explorers into your deck to deal with that. If you are something like Scouts, which actually, Scouts is a fine example. No, Scouts is a bad example because it's already beating Temple. So let's say Demacia Midrange, like Jax, right? Let's say Jax wants to put some... No, Jax is also beating it. Okay, let's say Jarvan. Yeah, let's say Jarvan wants to put in some... I don't know why it took me so long. Let's say Jarvan wants to put in some Landmark Destruction, right? You are Demacia Ionia. So let's say you're Shen Jarvan and you want access to some landmark removal. Your options are Scholarly Pioneer and Portal Pioneer. Portal Pioneer is 3 mana to kill a landmark. That's pretty good. The bad part is that it's a 1/1, and you are a deck that is sort of reliant on tempo and getting, like, you kind of really want a Shen level up to happen to actually have some oomph to try and finish off your opponent. But like, this 1/1 is so ignorable to them that it's not awful. The problem more so is that, like, while it is only 3 mana to kill the landmark, it is 2 unit mana, which means you're not getting down like a Screeching Dragon, or if you like stutter stepped on your Shen or what have you. Like, turn 5's not the biggest tempo turn for Shen Jarvan, but it still kind of sucks to just put a 1/1 in your deck, especially when you look at all of the other matchups where you're not really getting to take advantage of the landmark removal. And like, there's really not a lot of equipments running around or anything like that. So you're kind of going for either the heal or the keyword shut off. It's just a very mediocre card when you are not specifically killing Sunken Temple with it. And then for Scholarly Pioneer, even if you are killing Sunken Temple, that's 5 mana to kill it. And again, the body for the cost ratio is not something that Shen Jarvan wants going on. 2/3 Challenger for 3 mana, not great, even if you're shutting off keywords. So while it's easy to just kind of look at Sunken Temple and go, oh yeah, just put Explorers in your deck and kill the landmark. In reality, if you are not playing against a Sunken Temple deck, those Explorers are a liability. On top of the fact that you still need to draw them. And again, because they're a liability in other matchups, you really can't just blindly jam 3 of them into your deck. But if you want to reliably kill Sunken Temple, you need to blindly jam 3 of them into your deck. And that is why Sunken Temple is continuing to succeed despite the existence of Explorers happening in the exact same expansion as them. So, now that that's out of the way, that is why Sunken Temple is not getting dealt with as level 0 as you might expect. Champion Strength is doing well because it's, again, Scouts is going very wide. It's very difficult for Temple to keep up with that. If you get off a, what was it called? Blinding Light, Cosmic Light, something light, Inspiring Light. If you get off an Inspiring Light before your opponent is actually able to start getting like the 3 mana Divine Whirlwinds going, which usually doesn't start happening until like turn 4, turn 5, when they like Janna or they Temple. If you can get your units up to like 4 HP, because there are a number of 3/3s or just 3 health units in general in Scouts, you can get it up pretty quickly and be fine. So that's kind of why like CS is doing very well. Shen, Jarvan, and Ashe are like, I don't think Ashe is very good. I don't think Aatrox is very good. I think when we think about like mid-range, you really want to be looking at Shen Jarvan as like the most splashable option, and Jax Ornn is the most splashable option from big mid-range. So I already talked about the triangle and why these are the defining factors. And then when we look at like major players, it's just kind of like big mid-range because they do so well into Janna, and they also do pretty well into they're doing like okay into Champion Strength. So the way to read this stats say chart is, obviously I don't have everything listed out here, right? Like Jax Ornn says it's good into Janna, Nyla, and bad into mid-range. The things that aren't listed fall somewhere in the 45 to 55% category, or it's like a really good or really bad matchup, but it's like a deck that you don't expect to see. That said, pretty much every deck on here is like 60% into Lurk. Just figured I'd throw that one out there. So Jax Ornn is doing like fine into Champion Strength. In fact, Jax Ornn is doing fine into a lot of things. Its matchups nearly across the board are pretty 50-50, which is why I still think it deserves a spot in the meta staples major players. Aatrox, not so much. This is like much more of a, if you're worried about like Janna, Nyla plus elusive lineups, that's the only time I think Aatrox is sort of like a justifiable pick. Or if you get into Top Cut and like, there's just not as much mid-range as you expected running around. Because again, I think Ashe is a little bit of a liability. I think this is like a very dangerous bring. I don't think this is safe. I think Jarvan is safe. I don't think Ashe is safe. But let's just slow down a sec, take a breather, go deck by deck here on Stats Say. So Janna and Nyla obviously beating mid-range and losing to big mid-range, Overwhelm, and Champion Strength. I know it looks like there are a lot of targets on the back of Janna and Nyla, but the stats are being skewed by people that are not playing the deck as efficiently. Again, this is like an incredibly hard deck to play, and while you don't need to play it perfectly, you can't afford like 15 mistakes. You can afford like 2 or 3, maybe 5. And still do well into your opponent, assuming your opponent is also making some kinds of mistakes. But again, Janna and Nyla just has nut draws, and that's what we really look for out of good decks. I had a screenshot on Twitter where I was sort of saying like, yeah, I'm going to start screaming about good decks soon. It is turn 2 in this screenshot, and I have presented 8 damage to my opponent. I don't give a shit what kind of counter deck you tried to make. You're probably not beating this hand. And if you're wondering how this happened, it was Pool Shark on 1 that traded with a Beard the Bellringer, and then Matrim, I was going to just shuffle back whatever my fleeting card was to refill my spell mana, but it was one of these. So I was like, okay, yeah, let's shuffle back something else, draw a card, and I drew another one. And I'm like, okay, yeah, let's full send it. This is what Janna Nyla is capable of doing. You can have all the matchup charts in the world. This just happens sometimes, and that is one of the biggest strengths of a deck like this. So explosive. Scouts beating every Temple deck. That means Janna Nyla as well as the Seraphine decks. Seraphine decks are weird on the matchup charts, again, because the data is so skewed and scattered, because we have so many different champion combinations, whether you're playing Karma or just Seraphine and set or all those other combinations. It's actually very difficult to find data on, so I kept it off of this just because I wasn't really sure what I was going to put there. But Temple encompasses all of the decks that run Sunken Temple, which is not always Janna decks. That's what Scout's doing very well into. It's not doing so well into Shen, Elusives, or big midrange. But again, a lot of people seem very scared of big midrange, and that's why a lot of these lineups over here are comprised of Scouts and Nyla Janna. But Seraphine set has also been doing very well in these tournaments. Karma set one of the times as well. And discard, if you're confused, is Jinx Cannon. That's what discard is. Sorry it took me this long in the video to address it. Janna CS is really only good into Ashe. That's the only like blowout matchup it has, and then it's losing to Overwhelm, Scouts, and Shen, which is not a good look. And then you're also like, you're slightly favored into Janna Nyla, but again, I don't think you should be going like double champion strength and trying to target Janna Nyla, because Janna champion strength seems like a pretty big liability in your matchup day. I would just try to push Janna champion strength from your mind and really focus on Scouts here. Or if you want another champion strength deck, Formidable, which again, Formidable is a weird one where I probably could have put it under the CS umbrella. I maybe could have put it under the big mid-range umbrella, but I kind of kept it as its own because it's not really defined by either of those archetypes, but I'll get into the wildcard section later. Shen Jarvan, doing very well into big mid-range, champion strength, and Ashe. This is one of the big reasons that people want to bring this. It is the mid deck that is beating the other mid deck, as well as having good matchups into some of the more chaffy decks of the meta and champion strength. Like Scouts is going to be incredibly popular, just like Janna Nyla is. So having a good matchup into that is fine. If you're running mid-range, you need to be banning Janna Nyla. Like putting Shen Jarvan in your lineup is a really safe pick, but you do have to take Janna Nyla out of the equation in order to make it a safe pick. Ashe, doing good into like big mid-range and Overwhelm being Nardarius, and bad into Janna, champion strength, and Shet. That's not a good spread. That's all of tier 1. Or the meta definers, or whatever you want to call it. Ashe is losing to all 3 of them. That's not good. Don't bring Ashe. Then we get down to Jaxorn, doing well into Janna Nyla. It's a big selling point. Not doing well into mid-range again. Pretty 50-50 into everything else. Aatrox Vayne is doing pretty good, like noticeably well into aggro, specifically elusives, which makes sense, right? There's a good amount of healing coming out of the Aatrox, as well as a number of combat tricks. You've got some hardier units. I think elusives is really a matchup where the Ranger Knight Defector still shines, and that's why Aatrox is doing so well into it. And then, again, you're losing to the same things that Jax is, plus Jax. Not a great look, but again, not really sure how popular Jaxorn is going to be. Overwhelm is a little bit of a weird one, where the Nardarius is losing to Scouts, mid-range, and Jax on paper, which is not good, but it is beating Janna. And I think people are really tunneling on the fact that it's beating Janna without really looking at these other problems that it's having. So, like, if you are running into a lineup that is Janna, Nyla, Shen, Jarvan, and Scouts, which I don't even... Is that a lineup that anyone brought and won with? No. Surprising. But if you run into that lineup, then you really need to line up the Overwhelm into the Janna, because you're not doing well into Scouts or the Shen Jarvan. And so things get really awkward on your ban strategy as well as your first pick. And when things get wonky on first pick is when I'm really down on a deck, where it's like, this needs to line up into the Janna. If my opponent, like if you don't open Overwhelm and your opponent plays Janna Nyla and they beat something else and the Janna Nyla is off the table, your Overwhelm is getting destroyed by whatever, either the Shen Jarvan or the Scouts that you have left over. And then Elusives is doing good into all mid-range. So Jax, Jarvan, Ashe, Aatrox, that's really where Elusives is kind of shining in the meta. And then doing poorly into Overwhelm and Seraphine. It's doing like okay into Janna Nyla. Again, if it's not on the chart, that's because it's like pretty close to 50%, somewhere in the 54 to 46% range, which I've always said you can swing about 5 percentage points off skill alone. And then that's not even speaking on specific builds or tech cards. Flavors of aggro. Anti-Jin and discard. You can really see that we're scraping the bottom of the barrel here. Triple aggro is not a viable lineup since the nerfing of Wildfire, and the Wildfire nerf significantly slowed down the deck. I don't think you can just run back Wildfire and say, yeah, the card going to 2 mana hurt, but it's doable. I don't think we're in that situation. I think you're going to get run over by Janna Nyla, champion strength, and things of that nature, because Wildfire, with 1 mana Wildfire, had an average kill turn of like 6-7. And that's really long to be against a champion strength deck where you are not interacting with the board. It's not going to happen. Then we get into the wild cards. Deep is like... Let's talk about Deep. Deep is like losing to Janna Nyla, but not that bad. It's not getting stomped by Janna Nyla. It's doing, like, Aatrox Kane, again, I talked about this in the mid-range video. Aatrox Kane, not a deck in my mind. Neither is Jack Set. Like, ignore these. I know that they have crazy number of games, but that's because those are, like, from early on in the meta where these were, like, the top 5 decks for some reason. Don't bring Jack Set. Don't bring Aatrox Kane. Don't even look at them. It's doing poorly into Overwhelm. It's barely beating Frostbite mid-range. Caitlyn Teemo, you know, we could put Caitlyn Teemo in the wildcard section. But that's probably more of a top cut option. I would not run that in Swiss ever. In fact, if I put that there, someone's going to run it in Swiss and be like, Boulevard told me to. It's not doing well into Scouts. It's not doing well into the other champion strength deck. It's doing, like, Gwen Vayne is, like, pure chaff. That's the definition of chaff. If I say you're beating all the random shit, I mean Gwen Vayne. It's doing well into Shen Jarvan and Jack Zorn, and I think this might be where people are looking at Deep as a viable option. How is it doing into Seraphine is a question we kind of want answered. Seraphine's set IOPZ. It's barely, and the stats aren't even abundant. Yeah, I don't really know what people see in Deep, but it's been popping up. I think it's like, yeah, it's the 6th most played deck. It jumped up 37 spots in the last 2 days and also plummeted 8% win rate when it did that. So I wanna say that I do not condone Deep. I don't recommend this. I don't really know what's going on there. Formidable is another one of the decks on the, let's just sort this here. It'll make it a lot easier. Where's Volibear? Galio Volibear is actually doing pretty well for itself. It's not a very popular deck, but with the Janna Nyla decks becoming more popular, and like Formidable has some good matchups. Formidable is like the legitimate wild card, where when we look at the matchups for Formidable, it should be the only Galio deck. Oh no, people are still running Galio. That's crazy. Okay, you're doing really well into Janna Nyla, which I think is saying something. If you're if you are looking to soft counter the Janna Nyla, if you want to run like Jax Ornn plus Champion Strength plus another deck, like if you want to go like Jax Scouts, I think Formidable is a really solid third option to try and pick on the Janna Nyla. Again, like the Petricite Charger does so much in a matchup like that. You're beating Ashel Blanc because Frostbite is ineffective against you. You're not doing well against Darius Nart. It's kind of expected. Aatrox Vayne we're not going to look at. You're actually doing well into Scouts, which is nice. You can kind of like match them with the Champion Strength v Champion Strength, on top of the fact that, again, like Petricite Charger does not take damage from Misfortune ability. I say carefully, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, spells or skills. Okay, I was pretty sure. Does not take damage from Misfortune, so you've got a really effective blocker for the MF there, on top of the fact that like you just match them with a CS versus a CS. When you get into those late game situations and you two are just sort of sitting there staring at each other with your large boards, you have the heavy hitters. You have the Galio. You have the Volibear. When I was playing Formidable last patch, I really liked 2 Galio, 2 Volibear, 2 Garen, because 3 Galio, 3 Volibear felt very expensive. And games are just not going that long right now. I would recommend going a little bit lower on the champion curve, maybe throw some Garens in there, maybe just cut down on the number, like don't run 3 Volibear or something like that, It's not like a must-see. And then it's weird that you're not doing well into Janna Teemo, but I think that's just the pure number of elusives that they run. Caitlyn Teemo is ignorable. Pitiful into Jax Ornn, pitiful into Shen Jarvan is where the big red flags are for Formidable. Why it's not more prominent in the meta is you're losing to the best mid-range decks out there, which people are probably going to have at least one of these in their lineup, and it's not really something that you want to be focusing on for your ban strategy. But again, if you are just looking to if you just want to mess up the day of all the Janna Nyla players, then yeah, I think Formidable might have a spot in your lineup. And then when we talk about Seraphine's set, again, like kind of a hard one to actually nail down because of all the champion splits, but Seraphine's set seems to be the most popular. Doing okay into Janna Nyla, nothing too crazy. But then like piss poor into Scouts, not great into Frostbite. Okay, Caitlyn Teemo deck, whatever. Okay into Overwhelm, You're just like, you've got some volatile matchup charts. It's like weird that you're beating Shen Jarvan and not beating Ashel Blanc. Although it makes sense because like you're more of a singleton deck, so you don't have access to like a lot of Mystic shots and a lot of high notes. So if their like Trifarian Glory Seeker comes down, that's the 5-1, right? Yeah. Glory Seeker comes down, you like Mystic Shot it, they, Elixir of Iron it, you it's not unheard of that you're not going to have a second removal spell and you're just going to take 5 to the dome. Shen Jarvan, on the other hand, the stuns and the recalls are a lot more effective against a deck like this. You know, when they're playing 6 mana and 4 mana and 5 mana units, unlike Frostbite Midrange, where like they throw down a LeBlanc and like that's not a very good recall target. So you can see like the charts of the Seraphine set here, but again, like I wouldn't read too much into the stats on this one because the spread is so wide on champions, so like the stats are pretty bad. I think Seraphine set is like, having played it quite a bit at this point, it's a Seraphine deck. If you've enjoyed Seraphine decks in the past, you'll be fine with it. It's not my favorite Seraphine deck that I've ever played. It doesn't feel like the strongest Seraphine deck I've ever played. It's just kind of a good second Temple deck if you think Temple is the be-all end-all of competitive Legends of Runeterra right now, which like, it's not too far off the mark. But again, if you haven't played with Temple decks too often, I don't really think this is something you want to pick up today. Well, maybe today you could find enough time like Thursday, Friday to actually jam enough Temple games to be comfortable. So, top 5. What are the top 5 most represented decks that are going to be coming into Top Cut? Number 1, no question, Janna Nyla. Number 2, I would say again, no question, is going to be Scouts. Coming in at number 3 is probably going to be Shen Jarvan. And that's where things get a lot less clear. Because I don't think people love Jax. Jax, if anything, I could see Jax coming in at number 5, but Jax always tends to have like a higher play rate than I kind of expected it to. What's filling in the number 4 spot is a bit of a question to me, because it doesn't feel like... I mean, I guess if there's nothing that I can conceivably think of as number 5, then Jax is actually going to be number 4. When we look at the ladder data, what are we getting out of, what would we expect? I think, like, Lurk is number 5 on ladder, so that's going to be less than helpful. Caitlyn Teemo? No, it's not that. And if you're wondering why I don't, why like, Caitlyn Teemo keeps popping up on all these charts and, like, it's got such a high play rate and I'm just not touching on it, is, like, you're kind of a gimmicky deck that's built around beating the Temple decks by just filling their deck full of shrooms. And then sort of using Frostbite to survive against the more mid-rangey decks until like your shroom plan can come to fruition. I think the deck is just a little bit too RNG dependent, which yeah, it's kind of a trife excuse of puff cap decks that we've been using since the dawn of time, but that doesn't make it any less true. But I also just think that you still will lose to Janna Nyla and other Temple decks by virtue of them like cycling through one Temple sequence and then removing all of your units. Like every time I've played against Caitlyn Teemo rather as Janna Nyla, I haven't had any problems keeping the board clear. Sometimes I won't even play the Temple. You know, I'll just like updraft it back or something. Because you don't really have good removal in here, because you're not like throwing down a bunch of cards in one turn to take advantage of Howling Gale. Like we only see one copy of Howling Gale in here. You're not killing Janna. And if Janna levels, that's still really rough for you, because your opponent can just like kill you with all of their burn and elusive units and things of that nature. So that's one of my biggest problems with this deck, is I think it's a little bit too cheesy still. And that's the Boulevard opinion. You know, you might want to disagree. Again, I think when we talk about Top Cut, you could reevaluate a little bit. But for Swiss, I think that Caitlyn Teemo is losing to a lot of chaff, and chaff is most of what you're going to see. So for number 4, it feels like it's probably going to default to Darius Nar. It'll either be Overwhelm or Seraphine, and I'm really not sure which. I think Formidable has a shot, but again, Formidable is just like a little bit too weak to some of the major players, like Jarvan, because I can't really think of a lineup where like you want to be banning Jarvan. You know what I mean? And again, like you do very much have that like Demacia problem against barriers. While you're immune to Frostbite, you are certainly not immune to barriers. So I would say Overwhelm or Seraphine. So yeah, that is my analysis of the meta. If I were to run something, Boulevard's lineup, I would be playing Janna Nyla 100%. I would be playing Jax Ornn because I've been actually just like having a lot of success with that deck. I think it's pretty 50-50 into a lot of things, which I'm pretty comfortable in that domain. And then while I think Elusives is spicy, while I think Formidable is spicy, I would probably end up on... I don't really want to... like. So a lot of my games today on ladder have been Seraphine set Karma versus Scouts. And while I'm getting better at the matchup, I've done some risky shit that's paid off. Like, I'll keep Nopify in my opener and just snipe an Inspiring Light on turn 3, and that's like a huge payoff. But if they never drew the Inspiring Light, then, like, I'm a dumbass who kept a Nopify. I've been playing kind of fast and loose in that matchup, and it's been working out for me, but that's not something I'm confident working out over 9 rounds. I'm not really believing in the consistency of the Seraphine. If I wanted to be super consistent, I'd probably go for Scouts, and I would be, you know, leaving open Janna. I'd probably be banning Jarvan. You know what? Maybe if I'm on the ban Jarvan plan, maybe I do just run Formidable. You know? Maybe. Probably not. I'd have to think a little more about my third deck, but I'd go Janna, Nyla, Jaxorn for sure. I'm just not in love with Shen Jarvan, and I'm definitely not like a champion strength kind of guy. I don't think it's skill expressive enough for me. I want to feel like I'm playing the game, and even when I'm playing against champion strength, it doesn't really feel like me and my opponent are like having meaningful interactions. So like, I'm just not really a you know, go wide Demacia kind of guy. I'm not really a big Demacia guy. I'm a Demacia hater, except for Aatrox. But I'm not playing Aatrox this meta. No shot. Yeah, I'd be torn, but I'd be sitting here thinking about like Formidable, Elusives, Shen Jarvan, Scouts. Like if I have to play Scouts, I'll play Scouts, but yeah, it'd be tough for me to actually come up with a third one. If I had to like commit, like gun to my head, I'd say, yeah, sure, let's run the Galio. But that's, yeah, again, like this is a little wonky. This is a little Boulevard techie. And that's, your lineup should be personalized. What I am seeking to do here is give you a baseline, the level 0 of the meta, and then you go and you do a little bit more of the legwork and figure it out. But if you're just looking for a lineup recommendation, I think Scouts, Shen, Janna, Nyla is where you want to be at, and then you just ban Janna, Nyla. Scouts and Shen are good enough into the rest of the meta that you're going to be doing fine if you run into like a similar lineup, you know. So yeah, that is going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been helpful. Good luck in the World Championship Qualifier. I hope you succeed and your dreams come true and you can make it to the World Championship later this year. Good luck in your tournaments.